You've probably heard the story of Noah's Ark countless times. The animals marching two by two, the great flood, the rainbow promise. But what if I told you that the Bible contains a mystery so profound, so unsettling that most Sunday school teachers skip right over it? What if the flood wasn't just about wickedness and rain, but about something far more extraordinary hiding in plain sight? Tonight, as you settle into rest, we're going to explore the strangest mystery in all of Scripture. A story that connects ancient giants to a wooden boat, fallen angels to a family of 8, and cosmic judgment to the preservation of life itself. This isn't just another retelling of Noah's flood. This is the complete story they never taught you in Sunday school. Before we dive into these ancient waters, if you're new to this channel, consider hitting that subscribe button. We're building a community of seekers who aren't afraid to explore the deeper mysteries of faith. Also, let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. There's something beautiful about people around the world drifting off to sleep while contemplating the same ancient truths. So settle in, close your eyes if you'd like, and let's journey back to a time when the world was young, when giants walked the earth, and when the fate of all humanity hung in the balance. The world before the flood was nothing like the world we know today. Imagine a planet where men lived for centuries, where the very air was different, where the boundary between heaven and earth seemed thinner somehow. This was a world of wonders and terrors, of beauty and corruption, of ordinary families and extraordinary beings. The Bible tells us that in those days the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves from all whom they chose. These few words, tucked away in Genesis chapter 6, contain one of the most controversial and mysterious passages in all of Scripture. Who were these sons of God? What happened when they took human wives? And why does the text immediately shift to speak of giants in the earth? The Hebrew word used here is Nephilim, which means the fallen ones. These weren't just tall people or skilled warriors. According to the ancient texts, these were beings of extraordinary size and power, the offspring of a union that was never meant to be. They were the children of a cosmic rebellion, living symbols of a world spinning out of control. Picture this antediluvian world, if you will. Cities of stone and bronze gleaming in the sunlight, but shadows gathering in their streets. Men and women going about their daily lives, farming and building, loving and laughing, while among them walked beings who towered above the tallest trees. These giants weren't just physically imposing. They possessed knowledge that shouldn't have belonged to mortals, skills that seemed to bend the very laws of nature. The Book of Enoch, though not part of our modern Bible, was treasured by ancient Jewish communities and even quoted in the New Testament. It describes these giants as beings who taught humanity arts that were meant to remain hidden. Warfare and weapon-making, cosmetics and jewelry, astrology and sorcery. Knowledge that advanced civilization but corrupted the human heart. Imagine walking through a marketplace in those days. The normal sounds of commerce and conversation, children playing, animals being led to pasture. But then, casting a shadow across the square, one of the giants appears. 15 feet tall, perhaps 20, with eyes that held wisdom and malice in equal measure. The very ground would tremble beneath their steps. Ordinary people would fall silent, not just from fear, but from an instinctive recognition that they were in the presence of something that didn't belong in their world. These weren't gentle giants from fairy tales. According to the ancient accounts, they were violent, consuming, destructive. They devoured not just food, but eventually turned to consuming human beings themselves. They were a corruption of the natural order, a living violation of the boundary between heaven and earth. But here's where the story takes an even stranger turn. The giants weren't just individuals scattered across the earth. They were building something, a civilization, a culture, a world order that was fundamentally different from anything God had intended. They were creating a reality where might made right, where the strong preyed upon the weak without restraint, where the very concept of justice was being erased from human consciousness. The Bible tells us that God looked upon the earth and saw that the wickedness of man was great, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. But this wasn't just ordinary human sin. This was corruption on a cosmic scale. The genetic pool of humanity itself was being polluted. The image of God in man was being systematically destroyed. And in the midst of this chaos, this growing darkness, there was one family that remained pure. One bloodline that hadn't been corrupted by the unholy union of the supernatural and the natural. A man named Noah, whose name means rest or comfort, walking righteously in a world gone mad. Noah wasn't chosen because he was perfect. The scripture doesn't say he was sinless. It says he was righteous in his generation and that he walked with God. In the Hebrew text, there's a phrase that's often translated as perfect in his generations. But the word used is tamim, which can mean complete, whole, or without blemish. Some scholars suggest this isn't just referring to Noah's moral character, but to his genetic integrity. He was uncontaminated by the corruption that had spread through the human race. Picture Noah in those final days before the flood. An ordinary man, perhaps 5.5 feet tall, weathered by years of honest work, standing in the shadow of beings who could crush him with their bare hands. Yet he possessed something they didn't, a relationship with the creator of the universe. While they had knowledge stolen from heaven, he had wisdom given freely by God. The instruction came clearly, though it must have seemed impossible. Build an ark. Not just any boat, but a floating sanctuary of specific dimensions, constructed to exact specifications, 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, 30 cubits high. Rooms within rooms, decks upon decks, sealed with pitch inside and out. A vessel designed not just to float, but to preserve life itself through the coming catastrophe. But here's what makes this story even more remarkable. Noah wasn't just building a boat. He was building a rescue mission for the entire created order. Every kind of animal, every species of bird, every creeping thing. 2 of each unclean animal, 7 pairs of each clean animal. The ark would become a floating zoo, a genetic repository, a preservation chamber for life itself. The giants watched him build. For decades they watched, and they laughed. Here was this tiny man, this insignificant human, constructing a massive vessel miles from any body of water large enough to float it. They saw no threat in his actions. Perhaps they even found it amusing. After all, what could mere water do to beings who had conquered the earth itself? But Noah understood something the giants didn't. He knew that the God who had created the heavens and the earth was not bound by the limitations of the natural world. The same God who had separated the waters above from the waters below at creation could reverse that separation. The same God who had set boundaries for the seas could remove those boundaries. As the ark neared completion, something began to change in the natural world. Animals started behaving strangely. Birds flew in unusual patterns. The very air seemed to hold its breath. But still the giants paid no attention. They were too busy with their own affairs, too confident in their own power, too certain that they were beyond the reach of divine judgment. Noah's family worked alongside him through those final days. His wife, whose name isn't recorded in Scripture but whose faithfulness echoes through eternity. His 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, each with their own personalities and destinies. Their wives, who had married into a family that seemed to be building their lives around an impossible dream. They had endured decades of mockery, of being called fools, of being social outcasts in a world that prized conformity to the giant-dominated culture. But they had also witnessed something their neighbors hadn't. They had seen their father's intimate relationship with the Creator. They had watched him receive instructions that could only have come from beyond the natural world. They had participated in the construction of something that defied all conventional wisdom. And then, in the last days, something extraordinary began to happen. The animals started coming, not driven by human hands, but drawn by an instinct that transcended natural behavior. Pairs of creatures that had never been seen together, walking side by side toward the ark, lions and lambs, eagles and sparrows, creatures from every corner of the earth making their way to this one wooden vessel. The giants watched this too, and for the first time some of them began to feel uneasy. This wasn't natural, this wasn't normal, but it was too late for them to change course. They had invested too much in their rebellion, committed too deeply to their path of corruption. They had become locked into their fate by their own choices. As the last animals entered the ark, as Noah's family took their final steps into the vessel that would become their home for over a year, the door closed behind them. Not by human hands, but by the same divine power that had orchestrated everything else. The Bible simply says that the Lord shut him in, and then the waiting began. Inside the ark, a family of 8 humans and representatives of every living creature on earth. Outside, a world full of giants who had no idea what was coming. The stage was set for the most dramatic divine intervention in human history. But the flood itself was just the beginning of the mystery. What happened to the giants when the waters rose? How did beings of such size and power meet their end? And why do we find traces of giant bloodlines in the world after the flood if Noah's family were the only human survivors? These questions lead us into the deeper waters of biblical mystery, where ancient texts hint at truths that challenge our understanding of both history and theology. The story of Noah's Ark isn't just about a flood. It's about a cosmic conflict between good and evil, between the natural and the supernatural, between God's design for humanity and the forces that would corrupt it. As we continue this journey together, we'll explore what the ancient texts really say about these giants, how they lived, how they died, and how their story connects to the greater narrative of human history. We'll dive into the flood itself, not just as a story of judgment, but as a story of incredible mercy and preservation. So rest easy tonight knowing that even in the darkest chapters of human history, even when giants walked the earth and corruption seemed to reign supreme, there was a plan, there was a purpose, there was a way forward, and sometimes that way forward required building something that seemed impossible, trusting in promises that seemed too good to be true, and believing that the God who created the heavens and the earth was big enough to handle whatever giants might stand in the way. The waters are rising, but the ark is ready. The giants are about to face their judgment, but life itself will be preserved. This is just the beginning of the strangest mystery in all of Scripture, and we're just getting started. The day the fountains of the great deep broke open, the world learned what true terror felt like. But the giants who had ruled the earth for centuries discovered something that shook them to their core. They were not immortal after all. When the first drops began to fall, they were unlike any rain the world had ever seen. These weren't the gentle showers that watered crops or the seasonal storms that marked the changing weather. These drops fell with weight, with purpose, with the force of divine intention behind them. Each one carried within it the power to reshape the very foundations of the earth. The giants felt the change before anyone else. Their supernatural senses, heightened by their otherworldly heritage, detected the shift in atmospheric pressure, the trembling in the ground beneath their feet. But their pride, their arrogance, their centuries of unchallenged dominance had made them deaf to the warnings that had been sounding for decades. Picture the moment when the first giant realized what was happening. Standing perhaps 20 feet tall, muscles like twisted steel cables, eyes that had seen the rise and fall of human empires, suddenly feeling something they had never experienced before. Helplessness. The water wasn't just rising around their ankles. It was rising with supernatural speed, with unnatural force, defying every law of physics they thought they understood. These beings who had terrorized humanity, who had treated mortal men and women as playthings, who had corrupted the very genetic fabric of creation itself, suddenly found themselves subject to the same natural laws that governed the creatures they had dominated. Water filled their lungs just as it filled human lungs. Their massive bodies, designed for conquest and destruction, became anchors that dragged them down into the depths. But here's where the story becomes even more fascinating. The ancient texts suggest that the giants didn't simply drown quietly. They fought, they raged, they used every ounce of their supernatural strength to try to survive the rising waters. Some accounts describe them attempting to build their own arks, their own towers, their own refuges from the divine judgment that was washing over the world. Imagine the chaos of those final hours. Giants wading through rising waters, their heads still above the surface when ordinary humans had already perished. Using their massive hands to cling to mountain peaks, to grasp at cliff faces, to fight against the inevitable with a fury that shook the very foundations of the earth. The sound of their death cries echoing across the water-covered world like thunder that wouldn't cease. The Book of Enoch describes how some of these giants in their desperation turned on each other. Brothers who had ruled together for centuries suddenly became enemies, fighting over the last pieces of high ground, the last chances for survival. The unity that had made them so dangerous began to crumble as the waters rose and their options dwindled. But perhaps the most haunting detail from the ancient accounts is this. The giants possessed knowledge of things that would not be discovered by ordinary humans for thousands of years. They knew about metallurgy, about astronomy, about medicine and mathematics. They had libraries of knowledge, repositories of wisdom that had been passed down from their supernatural fathers. And all of it was being lost beneath the rising waters. Picture vast cities built by giant hands filled with scrolls and tablets containing secrets that could have advanced human civilization by millennia. Observatories where giants had mapped the movements of stars with precision that wouldn't be matched until the modern era. Workshops where they had forged metals and created alloys that ordinary humans couldn't duplicate. All of it sliding beneath the waves lost forever to the depths. The irony wasn't lost on those who survived to record these events. The beings who had seemed most powerful, most advanced, most capable of surviving anything the world could throw at them, were the very ones who were most helpless when the Creator decided to reset the world. Their size, their strength, their knowledge, their supernatural heritage, none of it mattered when the waters rose. Meanwhile, inside the ark, Noah's family experienced something entirely different. They felt the vessel lift gently from its resting place, felt the smooth motion as it began to float on waters that were destroying everything they had ever known. The same water that was bringing death to the giants was bringing salvation to them. The same divine power that was executing judgment was also providing mercy. But don't think for a moment that this was easy for Noah's family. They could hear what was happening outside. The screams, the crashes, the sounds of a world dying. They knew that everyone they had ever known, except for the 8 souls in the ark, was perishing in the flood. Friends, neighbors, distant relatives, all of them were being swept away by the rising waters. Noah's wife must have wept for the women she had known, the children she had watched grow up, the communities that had been part of her life for centuries. His sons must have thought about the friends they had played with as children, the people they had tried to warn, the lives that could have been saved if only they had listened. The psychological weight of being the sole survivors of the human race was almost unbearable. They were witnessing the end of the world as they knew it, carrying the burden of knowing that everything would now depend on them. The future of humanity, the future of every living creature on earth rested in their hands, and yet they also experienced something miraculous. Inside the ark, peace reigned. The animals that should have been predators and prey coexisted in harmony. The lions lay down with the lambs, not metaphorically, but literally. The supernatural peace that God had placed over the ark extended to every living creature within its walls. This wasn't natural. Lions don't naturally ignore zebras. Hawks don't naturally ignore mice. The very fact that this floating zoo functioned at all was a miracle that sustained itself day after day, week after week, month after month. It was as if the ark existed in a different reality, governed by different laws, protected by different powers. The giants outside had no access to this peace. They had rejected the very source of it centuries earlier when they chose rebellion over obedience, corruption over purity, their own will over God's design. Now as the waters rose around them, they discovered that all their power, all their knowledge, all their supernatural advantages were useless against divine judgment. But here's what makes this story even more mysterious. Some of the ancient texts suggest that not all of the giants died in the flood, that some of them somehow found ways to survive. Not in the ark, obviously, but through other means. Hidden caves that were sealed against the waters. Underground chambers that could sustain life, or perhaps most disturbing of all, through the genetic corruption that had already been introduced into the human bloodline. This would explain one of the most puzzling aspects of the post-flood world. If Noah's family were the only human survivors, and if the giants were completely destroyed, then where did the giants come from, who appear later in biblical history? The Anakim, the Rephaim, the sons of Anak who terrified the Israelite spies. Where did they originate? The answer might be more complex than we've traditionally understood. Perhaps the corruption that the giants had introduced into the human genetic pool wasn't completely eliminated by the flood. Perhaps it lay dormant, waiting for the right conditions to manifest again. Or perhaps some of the giants found ways to preserve themselves, their knowledge, or their genetic material through the catastrophe. This possibility adds another layer of mystery to an already complex story. It suggests that the flood, while devastating and complete in its judgment, might not have been the final word in the conflict between good and evil, between God's design and the forces that would corrupt it. As the waters continued to rise, covering the highest mountains, drowning the mightiest giants, washing away every trace of the corrupted civilization they had built, something else was happening. The world was being cleansed, yes, but it was also being prepared for a new beginning, a fresh start, a chance for humanity to choose a different path. The ark floated on, carrying its precious cargo of life through the dark waters of judgment toward the promise of dry land and new beginnings. But the mysteries surrounding the giants and their fate would continue to echo through human history, appearing in the stories and legends of every culture, manifesting in archaeological discoveries that don't quite fit our understanding of the past. Tonight, as you rest, consider the profound truth hidden within this ancient story. Even when evil seems to triumph, even when corruption appears to have won, even when giants walk the earth and darkness covers the land, there is always a plan. There is always a way forward. There is always an ark being built by faithful hands, guided by divine wisdom, designed to preserve what matters most. The giants met their judgment in the rising waters, but life itself was preserved in a wooden vessel that defied every expectation. The story continues, the mystery deepens, and the waters of the great flood carry us toward revelations that will reshape our understanding of both the past and the future. The morning after the floodwaters receded revealed a world transformed beyond recognition. Where once mighty cities had stood, now only smooth plains of mud stretched to the horizon. The very geography had been rewritten by the cosmic catastrophe. Mountain ranges had shifted, rivers had carved new paths, and the familiar landmarks of the antediluvian world had vanished as completely as if they had never existed. But scattered across this transformed landscape were mysteries that would puzzle humanity for millennia to come. Massive stone structures partially buried and broken that seemed to have been built for beings far larger than ordinary humans. tools of impossible size, weapons that no normal person could wield, architectural remnants that suggested a civilization of giants had once dominated the earth. Noah's family, as they finally stepped from the ark onto solid ground, found themselves in a world that was simultaneously familiar and alien. The sun still rose in the east and set in the west. The seasons still turned in their appointed cycles. But everything else had changed. The very air seemed different, cleaner somehow, as if the corruption that had tainted the atmosphere itself had been washed away. The silence was perhaps the most unsettling aspect of their new reality. For the first time in their lives, they heard no distant sounds of giant footsteps, no echoing voices of beings who had once ruled the earth. The oppressive presence that had loomed over humanity for centuries was gone, leaving behind an emptiness that was both liberating and terrifying. Shem, Ham, and Japheth walked carefully across the muddy ground, their eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of the world they had known. But that world was gone, buried beneath layers of sediment and time. They were pioneers now, not just survivors. They carried within their memories the entire history of human civilization, and upon their shoulders rested the responsibility of rebuilding everything from scratch. The animals that emerged from the ark seemed to understand this too. They moved with purpose, spreading out across the empty landscape, driven by instincts that had been preserved through the long months of confinement. But even they seemed different somehow, as if the supernatural peace that had reigned within the ark had left a permanent mark on their nature. Noah himself stood at the threshold of the ark for a long moment before stepping onto the new earth. This man who had walked with God, who had received direct instructions from the Creator, who had witnessed the end of one world and the beginning of another, understood better than anyone the magnitude of what had just occurred. He was no longer just a man. He was the patriarch of a new humanity, the father of a reborn world. The first thing he did was build an altar. Not a house for his family, not a shelter from the elements, but a place of worship. He understood that this new world needed to be founded on a different principle than the old one. Where the giants had built their civilization on power and corruption, this new world would be built on reverence and gratitude. The smoke from Noah's sacrifice rose into the clear sky, carrying with it the prayers and thanksgiving of the only human family left on earth. It was a declaration that this new beginning would be different, that the mistakes of the past would not be repeated, that humanity would choose a better path. But even as they celebrated their survival and gave thanks for their preservation, questions lingered in the depths of their hearts. The giants were gone, yes, but what about the knowledge they had possessed? What about the technologies they had developed? What about the secrets they had learned from their supernatural fathers? Some of that knowledge had been lost forever, buried beneath the floodwaters along with the cities and libraries of the giant civilization. But some of it might have survived, preserved in hidden caches, encoded in symbols and stories, passed down through bloodlines that carried more than just human DNA. The ancient texts hint at this possibility in ways that are both fascinating and disturbing. They speak of knowledge that was written in the earth itself, of secrets that were hidden in the stones, of wisdom that was preserved in the blood. These cryptic references suggest that the giants, knowing their end was approaching, might have found ways to ensure their legacy would survive even if they did not. Archaeological discoveries in our modern era have uncovered artifacts that seem to support these ancient accounts. Massive stone blocks cut with precision that rivals our modern technology. Tools and weapons sized for beings much larger than ordinary humans. Art and architecture that suggests a level of sophistication that doesn't match our understanding of ancient civilizations. But perhaps the most intriguing evidence comes from the genetic studies that have revealed anomalies in human DNA that scientists struggle to explain. Genetic markers that don't fit the standard evolutionary model, sequences that seem to have been introduced into the human genome from an unknown source, variations that suggest our ancestors might have interbred with beings that weren't entirely human. Could these be the remnants of the giant corruption that the flood was meant to cleanse? Could the genetic pollution that had threatened humanity in the antediluvian world have somehow survived the catastrophe? These questions lead us into territory that challenges both our scientific understanding and our theological assumptions. The story of Noah's Ark, when viewed through this lens, becomes more than just a tale of divine judgment and mercy. It becomes a story of genetic warfare, of cosmic conflict played out on the stage of human history. The Ark wasn't just a boat, it was a genetic repository, a carefully curated collection of uncontaminated life forms designed to preserve the original blueprint of creation. But if the corruption somehow survived, if the giant bloodlines found ways to persist through the flood, then the conflict wasn't over. It was just beginning a new phase. The post-flood world would see the emergence of new giants, new manifestations of the same supernatural corruption that had plagued the antediluvian world. This would explain the biblical accounts of giants appearing in the land of Canaan, of the Anakim and the Rephaim, of the sons of Anak who struck fear into the hearts of the Israelite spies. These weren't new creations. They were the resurgence of an ancient corruption, the return of a threat that had been temporarily suppressed, but not completely eliminated. The implications of this understanding are staggering. If the giants could survive the flood, if their corruption could persist through the greatest divine judgment in human history, then what does that say about the nature of evil itself? What does it tell us about the ongoing battle between good and evil, between God's design and the forces that would corrupt it? Perhaps the flood wasn't meant to be a final solution, but rather a reset, a chance for humanity to start over with a cleaner slate. The giants were removed from positions of power and dominance, but the potential for their return remained. The choice of whether to resist that corruption or embrace it was left to future generations. This interpretation adds depth and complexity to the story of Noah's Ark that goes far beyond the simple Sunday school narrative. It suggests that the flood was not just about judgment and mercy, but about preparation for an ongoing conflict that would span all of human history. As Noah's family began the long work of repopulating the earth, they carried with them not just the responsibility of rebuilding civilization, but the burden of remembering. They were the keepers of the true history, the guardians of the knowledge of what had really happened in the world before the flood. But memory is fragile. especially when it passes from generation to generation. Details get lost, stories get distorted, truth becomes legend, and legend becomes myth. The clear understanding of the giant threat that Noah possessed would gradually fade as his descendants spread across the earth and built new civilizations. Some of that knowledge was preserved in the sacred texts, in the careful genealogies and historical accounts that form the backbone of biblical history. But much of it was lost or transformed, appearing in later cultures as myths and legends about titans and gods, about heroes and monsters, about a golden age that ended in catastrophe. The story of Noah's Ark, when understood in its full context, becomes a key to unlocking these later mysteries. It provides the historical foundation for understanding why every culture on Earth has flood stories, why giant myths appear in civilizations that had no contact with each other, why the theme of divine judgment and preservation appears again and again in human literature and religion. But it also serves as a warning. If the giants could return once, they could return again. If the corruption could survive the flood, it could manifest in new forms, in new generations, in new threats to humanity's future. The vigilance that Noah exercised in building the ark, the faithfulness that preserved his family through the catastrophe would be needed again and again as history unfolded. The mystery of Noah's Ark and the giants is not just about the past. It's about the present and the future. It's about understanding the true nature of the conflict between good and evil, between God's design and the forces that would corrupt it. It's about recognizing that sometimes the greatest threats come not from obvious enemies, but from corruption that works from within, from compromise that appears beneficial but leads to destruction. As you drift towards sleep tonight, consider the profound truth hidden within this ancient mystery. The world has been flooded before, cleansed of corruption, given a fresh start. But the potential for corruption remains, waiting for the right conditions to manifest again. The choice of whether to resist that corruption or embrace it, whether to build arks of preservation or towers of pride, remains with each generation. The giants may be gone, but their legacy lives on in the choices we make, the values we embrace, the future we build. The floodwaters have receded, but the lessons they taught about judgment and mercy, about corruption and preservation, about the consequences of our choices remain as relevant today as they were in Noah's time. The ark has landed on dry ground, but the journey is far from over. The mystery deepens, the questions multiply, and the ancient conflict between good and evil continues to unfold in ways that echo the very patterns established in those first days after the flood. The story of Noah's Ark is not just history, it's prophecy, warning, and hope, all wrapped together in a narrative that continues to shape our understanding of the world we live in and the choices we face. The descendants of Noah spread across the earth like seeds scattered by a divine hand, each carrying within them the memory of waters that had covered the highest mountains and the silence that followed the last giant's death cry. But memory, like water, has a way of changing shape as it flows through generations, and the clear truth that Noah knew began to fragment into 1,000 different streams. Shem walked eastward with his family, his steps measured and purposeful. He was the keeper of the sacred stories, the one who remembered most clearly the sound of his father's voice speaking with the Creator in the evening hours. His children gathered around him each night to hear again about the animals that came 2 by 2, about the rain that fell for 40 days and nights, about the rainbow that promised never again would all flesh be cut off by the waters of a flood. But even Shem's careful telling began to change as his family grew and spread. His grandson would tell the story with slightly different details. His great-grandson would add elements that seemed to make the narrative more vivid, more compelling to young ears that had never known a world where giants cast shadows across entire villages. Ham journeyed southward, his restless spirit driving him toward warmer lands where the sun burned bright and rivers ran strong. He carried different memories than his brothers, darker recollections of the world before the flood. He had seen things in those final days that haunted his dreams. Giants performing rituals that bent the very fabric of reality. Knowledge being passed down through bloodlines that should have been extinguished. His descendants built cities with walls that reached toward heaven. Not in defiance of God like the tower builders who would come later, but in memory of beings who had once stood tall enough to touch the clouds. They carved images in stone, massive faces with features that seemed almost human but not quite, monuments to power and knowledge that had been lost beneath the rising waters. Japheth moved northward and westward, his curious mind always seeking new horizons, new mysteries to unravel. His family became explorers and wanderers, crossing mountains and seas, finding islands that had never known human footsteps. But wherever they went, they carried with them fragments of the old knowledge, pieces of understanding that had somehow survived the flood. These fragments appeared in their art, in the massive stone circles they built to track the movements of stars, in the metalwork that seemed too advanced for people who were supposedly starting civilization from scratch. They told stories around their fires of beings who had taught their ancestors the secrets of the heavens, of knowledge that had been preserved in dreams and visions, of wisdom that came not through learning but through blood. The animals, too, carried their own memories. The lions remembered a time when they had lived in peace with lambs, when their hunger had been satisfied without the taking of life. The eagles recalled months of confinement followed by the joy of unlimited sky. The serpents perhaps held the deepest memories of all, genetic echoes of a time when their kind had walked upright and spoken words that changed the course of human history. But it was the humans who struggled most with the weight of what they remembered and what they had forgotten. Each generation that passed took them further from the direct experience of the flood, further from the clear understanding of why it had been necessary, further from the stark reality of what the world had been like when giants ruled and corruption filled the earth. The stories began to change in subtle ways. The giants became heroes in some tellings, mighty warriors who had defended humanity against other threats. The flood became a natural disaster rather than divine judgment, a tragedy that had claimed the lives of noble beings who deserved better. The ark became a symbol of human ingenuity rather than divine mercy, proof that mortals could overcome any obstacle through their own wisdom and effort. These distortions weren't malicious. They arose from the very human tendency to make sense of the incomprehensible. to find meaning in suffering, to create narratives that made their ancestors seem heroic rather than corrupt. But each small change in the telling moved them further from the truth, further from the understanding that would help them recognize the signs if such corruption ever appeared again. Meanwhile, in the hidden places of the earth, other remnants of the antediluvian world began to stir. The flood had been thorough, yes, but the earth is vast and full of secret places, deep caves that had been sealed by the rising waters but not filled, underground chambers where air had been trapped, creating pockets of survival in the most unlikely places. Ancient structures built by giants who had possessed knowledge of preservation that went beyond anything their human contemporaries understood. Some texts speak of giants who had foreseen the flood through their supernatural connections, beings who had prepared for the catastrophe by creating refuges that could sustain life through the long months of inundation. These weren't arks like Noah's designed to float upon the surface. These were bunkers, sealed environments carved into the living rock, supplied with air and food and water through means that defied ordinary understanding. If such places existed, if even a few giants had found ways to survive the flood, then their emergence into the post-flood world would have been gradual, careful, strategic. They would have been vastly outnumbered by Noah's growing family. They would have needed to work from the shadows, influencing rather than dominating, corrupting rather than conquering. This would explain the strange artifacts that archaeologists continue to discover, the out-of-place technologies that suggest ancient civilizations possessed knowledge they shouldn't have had. It would account for the sudden leaps in human development that marked certain periods of history, advances that seemed to come from nowhere, innovations that required understanding of principles that wouldn't be formally discovered for centuries. More disturbing still, it might explain the persistent reports throughout history of beings that were almost human but not quite. Creatures that possessed intelligence and knowledge beyond their apparent nature. Every culture has stories of such beings, teachers who appeared from nowhere to share wisdom with early civilizations, gods and demigods who took human form to walk among mortals. Were these merely myths and legends, products of primitive minds trying to understand natural phenomena? Or were they memories distorted by time and retelling of actual encounters with survivors of the antediluvian world? The line between history and mythology begins to blur when we consider the possibility that some myths might be based on events that really occurred. The ancient Sumerian texts speak of the Anunnaki, beings who came from the sky to teach humanity the arts of civilization. The Egyptian records tell of the Neteru, god-kings who ruled in the earliest dynasties and possessed powers that seemed supernatural to ordinary humans. The Hindu Vedas describe the Devas, beings of great knowledge and ability who interacted with humans in the distant past. All of these accounts share common elements that are remarkably similar to the biblical descriptions of the giants, beings who were larger and more powerful than ordinary humans, creatures who possessed advanced knowledge of astronomy, mathematics, metallurgy, and other sciences, entities who seem to exist on the boundary between the natural and supernatural worlds. Could these diverse cultural memories be fragments of the same historical reality? Could they be echoes of encounters with giant survivors who had emerged from their flood refuges to influence the development of early human civilizations? The possibility is both fascinating and terrifying, suggesting that the corruption the flood was meant to cleanse had found ways to reassert itself in the post-Diluvian world. But not all the influence of these possible survivors was necessarily malevolent. Some of the knowledge they possessed could have been genuinely beneficial to struggling human communities. Agricultural techniques that increased crop yields, medical knowledge that saved lives, astronomical understanding that helped with navigation and timekeeping, mathematical principles that enabled more sophisticated architecture and engineering. The challenge would have been distinguishing between knowledge that was genuinely helpful and knowledge that came with hidden costs, between teachings that elevated humanity and influences that slowly corrupted it. The giants of the antediluvian world had been masters of this kind of subtle manipulation, offering benefits that came with strings attached, sharing wisdom that gradually led to dependence and ultimately to domination. Noah's descendants scattered across the earth and gradually losing touch with their original understanding would have been particularly vulnerable to such influences. They retained memories of a time when beings of great knowledge had existed, but they had lost the clear understanding of why those beings had been judged and destroyed. To them, the giants might have seemed like lost benefactors rather than defeated enemies. This vulnerability would have been exploited by any surviving giants who emerged from their hiding places. They wouldn't have revealed themselves openly, not initially. They would have worked through intermediaries, through human agents who could be influenced or corrupted. They would have shared their knowledge gradually, creating dependencies that would be difficult to break. Over time, human societies that fell under such influence would have begun to exhibit characteristics similar to the antediluvian world, increasing focus on power and domination, growing acceptance of violence as a means of solving problems, gradual erosion of the moral boundaries that had been established in the aftermath of the flood. The corruption wouldn't have been obvious at first. It would have appeared as progress, as advancement, as the natural development of human civilization. Only those who retained the clearest memories of why the flood had been necessary would have recognized the warning signs, and their voices would have been easily dismissed as the paranoid fears of religious fundamentalists. This pattern of gradual corruption followed by divine intervention would repeat itself throughout human history, appearing in various forms in different cultures and time periods. The story of Noah's Ark wasn't just about a single event in the distant past. It was about an ongoing conflict between the forces of corruption and preservation, between those who would elevate humanity through proper means and those who would offer shortcuts that led to destruction. Each time the corruption reached critical levels, divine intervention would reset the situation, not always through catastrophic floods, but through various forms of judgment and renewal. The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, the conquest of Canaan by the Israelites, the fall of Babylon and other corrupt empires throughout history. But the potential for corruption would always remain, waiting for the right conditions to manifest again. The giants might be gone, but the spiritual forces that had originally corrupted them were still active in the world, still seeking ways to influence human development, still working to corrupt the image of God in humanity. Understanding this ongoing conflict helps us make sense of the biblical narrative as a whole, seeing it not as a collection of disconnected stories, but as chapters in a larger saga of cosmic warfare played out on the stage of human history. The flood was a major battle in this war, but it wasn't the final victory. That would come later through different means involving different players but following the same basic pattern of corruption, judgment, and renewal. As you rest tonight, consider the profound implications of this ancient mystery. The world you live in carries within it the seeds of both corruption and preservation, the potential for both great evil and great good. The choices you make, the values you embrace, the influences you allow into your life, all of these participate in the ongoing conflict between the forces that would elevate humanity and those that would corrupt it. The giants may be gone, but their legacy lives on in every human heart that chooses power over service, in every civilization that mistakes technological advancement for moral progress, in every generation that forgets the lessons of the past and thinks itself immune to the corruptions that destroyed those who came before. But there is also hope, embodied in the memory of a wooden ark that carried life through the darkest waters, in the promise of a rainbow that spans the sky after every storm, in the knowledge that no matter how dark the corruption becomes, there is always a way forward for those who choose faithfulness over convenience, truth over comfort, righteousness over success. The mystery deepens, but so does our understanding. The waters have receded, but the lessons remain. The giants have fallen, but the choice between good and evil continues in every human heart, in every generation, in every moment when we must decide whether to build arks of preservation or towers of pride. The return of the giants wasn't announced with trumpet blasts or earthquake tremors. It began with whispers in the shadows, with children born slightly larger than their parents, with bloodlines that carried memories they shouldn't have possessed. The corruption that the flood was meant to cleanse had found new pathways back into the world, like water seeping through cracks in a dam that seemed solid but had been compromised from within. In the land of Canaan, where Noah's descendants had spread and multiplied, strange reports began to circulate. Travelers spoke of encountering beings who stood head and shoulders above the tallest men, whose eyes held knowledge that seemed older than their years. These weren't the towering monsters of the antediluvian world. Not yet, but they were unmistakably different, unmistakably wrong in ways that made ordinary people's skin crawl with ancestral fear. The Anakim emerged first, their name meaning long-necked ones in the ancient tongue. They established themselves in the hill country, building cities with walls that seemed designed for inhabitants much larger than normal humans. Their masonry was different too, employing techniques that allowed them to move stones that should have required dozens of men to lift. The locals who lived in their shadow spoke of them with a mixture of awe and terror, recognizing in their presence an echo of something that had once ruled the world. But how was this possible? How could giants return to a world that had been cleansed by the flood? The answer lies in the complexity of corruption itself, in the ways that evil finds to preserve itself even through the most thorough divine judgment. The giants who had ruled the antediluvian world hadn't just been physical beings. They had been the products of a spiritual corruption that had infected the very fabric of reality. When the Bible speaks of the sons of God taking wives from the daughters of men, it's describing more than just physical union. It's describing a contamination that went deeper than genetics, a corruption that affected the spiritual DNA of humanity itself. This corruption didn't just create giants. It created the potential for giants, the spiritual and genetic conditions that could manifest in giant offspring under the right circumstances. The flood had eliminated the giants themselves, but it hadn't eliminated the fallen angels who had originally corrupted humanity. These spiritual beings cast out of heaven for their rebellion were still active in the world, still seeking ways to corrupt God's creation, still working to recreate the conditions that had existed before the flood. They couldn't simply repeat their original strategy. The flood had served as a warning, a demonstration of what would happen if corruption reached the same levels again. But they could work more subtly, more carefully, finding ways to reintroduce their influence without triggering the same kind of catastrophic divine response. The post-flood giants weren't the result of new unions between fallen angels and human women. They were the product of dormant corruption being reactivated, of genetic and spiritual potential that had been suppressed but not eliminated. Like seeds that can lie dormant for decades before finding the right conditions to sprout, the corruption that had created the original giants found new ways to manifest in the post-flood world. This explains why the post-flood giants were different from their antediluvian predecessors. They were smaller, less numerous, less overtly supernatural. They possessed knowledge and abilities that exceeded normal human parameters, but they weren't the reality-bending monsters who had once threatened to corrupt all flesh. They were echoes of the original corruption, shadows of the beings who had once ruled the earth. The Rephaim appeared next, their name meaning the dead ones, or the shades. They settled in the lands east of the Jordan, building cities that seemed to exist partially in the physical world and partially in some other realm. Travelers who encountered them reported strange phenomena, shadows that moved independently of their owners, voices that seemed to come from empty air, knowledge of events that hadn't yet occurred. These beings possessed a connection to the spiritual realm that went beyond normal human experience. They could communicate with entities that existed beyond the physical world, accessing knowledge and power that gave them significant advantages over ordinary humans. But this connection came with a price. The more they drew on spiritual power, the less human they became, the more they resembled the fallen angels who had originally corrupted their bloodlines. The sons of Anak represented perhaps the most dangerous development in the return of giant corruption. Unlike the Anakim or the Rephaim, who seemed content to rule their own territories, the sons of Anak were expansionist. They sought to spread their influence, to corrupt other bloodlines, to gradually recreate the conditions that had existed in the antediluvian world. They established networks of influence that extended far beyond their physical territories. Through intermarriage, through the sharing of knowledge, through the gradual corruption of human institutions, they worked to create a world where giant influence would once again dominate human affairs. They were patient, methodical, willing to work across generations to achieve their goals. The Israelite spies who encountered them understood instinctively what they were seeing. These weren't just large humans who happened to be skilled warriors. These were the return of something that had been judged and destroyed, something that represented an existential threat to humanity's future. Their report to Moses wasn't just about military strength. It was about spiritual warfare, about the return of corruption that could undo everything the flood had accomplished. But the corruption wasn't limited to the obvious giants. It was also working through more subtle channels, through human leaders who had been influenced by giant knowledge, through religious systems that incorporated fallen angel teachings, through technologies that seemed beneficial but carried hidden costs. The ancient world was full of such influences. Mystery schools that taught secret knowledge supposedly passed down from the gods. Technological innovations that seemed to come from nowhere, developed by individuals who claimed to have received the knowledge in dreams or visions. Religious practices that involved communion with spiritual beings who offered power and wisdom in exchange for worship and obedience. All of these represented different aspects of the same corruption that had originally produced the giants. They were attempts to recreate the conditions that had existed before the flood, to establish once again a world where fallen angels could influence human affairs through willing human intermediaries. The builders of the Tower of Babel represented one such attempt. Their project wasn't just about architectural achievement. It was about creating a focal point for spiritual corruption, a structure that would serve as a beacon for fallen angels, seeking to re-establish their influence over humanity. The confusion of languages that God imposed wasn't just about preventing the tower's completion. It was about breaking up the concentration of corruption that was beginning to coalesce around the project. But the scattering of humanity that resulted from Babel also created new opportunities for corruption to spread. Different groups, speaking different languages, developing different cultures, became isolated from each other, and from the clear memories of why the flood had been necessary. This isolation made them more vulnerable to influences that might have been recognized and rejected by a more unified humanity. The giants took advantage of this fragmentation, appearing in different regions under different names, adapting their approach to local conditions and cultural expectations. In some places, they presented themselves as gods or demigods, demanding worship and offering protection in return. In others, they worked through human intermediaries, sharing knowledge and power that gradually corrupted entire civilizations. The patterns were always the same, regardless of the specific cultural context. Initial contact would be beneficial, offering solutions to pressing problems or knowledge that improved quality of life. Gradually, the relationship would deepen, creating dependencies that were difficult to break. Eventually, the corruption would spread throughout the society, affecting not just individuals but institutions, not just leaders but entire populations. The societies that fell under such influence would begin to exhibit characteristics similar to the antediluvian world: increasing violence and moral corruption, growing acceptance of practices that previous generations would have found abhorrent, gradual erosion of the boundaries between the natural and supernatural realms. Archaeological evidence suggests that many ancient civilizations went through such cycles of corruption and collapse. Great cities that were suddenly abandoned, sophisticated technologies that were inexplicably lost, artistic and architectural achievements that seemed to exceed the capabilities of their supposed creators. These weren't necessarily the results of natural disasters or military conquests. They were the consequences of spiritual corruption reaching critical levels, triggering divine intervention that reset the situation before it could spread further. The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, the collapse of various ancient empires, the mysterious disappearance of entire civilizations. Each time the pattern was the same. Corruption would gradually increase until it reached a tipping point. Divine judgment would follow, not always in the form of catastrophic destruction, but through various means that effectively neutralized the threat. The corrupt elements would be eliminated or scattered, and humanity would have another chance to choose a different path. But the potential for corruption would always remain. The fallen angels who had originally corrupted humanity were still active, still seeking opportunities to re-establish their influence. The spiritual and genetic potential for giant manifestation was still present in the human population, waiting for the right conditions to activate. This ongoing conflict between corruption and preservation forms the hidden backdrop for much of human history. The obvious events that historians focus on, wars, conquests, the rise and fall of empires, were often surface manifestations of deeper spiritual conflicts. The real battle was always between the forces that sought to corrupt humanity and those that sought to preserve it. Understanding this context helps explain many of the mysteries and apparent contradictions in ancient history. Why some civilizations achieved levels of sophistication that seem impossible for their time period. Why certain technologies were developed and then mysteriously lost. Why similar symbols and stories appear in cultures that supposedly had no contact with each other. It also helps explain the persistent presence of giant stories in human culture. These aren't just myths and legends created by primitive minds trying to understand natural phenomena. They're cultural memories of real encounters with beings that represented a corruption of the natural order, a threat to humanity's future that had to be recognized and resisted. The biblical accounts of Israelite encounters with giants aren't just historical records. They're teaching tools designed to help future generations recognize the signs of such corruption and understand the necessity of resisting it. The detailed descriptions of giant territories, the careful genealogies that track corrupt bloodlines, the specific instructions for dealing with giant populations, all of these serve to preserve crucial knowledge about an ongoing spiritual conflict. But the corruption wasn't just external. It was also internal, working through the human tendency to seek shortcuts, to desire power and knowledge without regard for the consequences. Every generation faced the same choice that had confronted humanity in the antediluvian world. whether to seek advancement through proper means or to accept the offerings of entities that promised much but delivered corruption. The giants who returned after the flood weren't just physical beings. They were symbols of a spiritual reality that continued to threaten humanity. They represented the persistent temptation to accept corruption in exchange for power, to trade away human dignity and divine image for temporary advantages that ultimately led to destruction. As you rest tonight, consider how this ancient pattern continues to play out in our modern world. The names have changed, the specific forms of corruption have evolved, but the basic conflict remains the same. In every generation, in every culture, in every human heart, the choice must be made between the path of corruption and the path of preservation. The giants may take different forms in different eras, but they always represent the same fundamental threat to human dignity and divine design. Sometimes they appear as political systems that promise utopia but deliver tyranny. Sometimes they manifest as technologies that offer convenience but demand freedom. Sometimes they present themselves as spiritual teachings that claim to elevate humanity but actually corrupt it. The key to recognizing such corruption lies not in its obvious evil. Corruption is always most dangerous when it appears beneficial, but in its fundamental character. Does it elevate human dignity or diminish it? Does it strengthen the bonds between people or weaken them? Does it draw humanity closer to divine design or further from it? The flood was a reset, a chance for humanity to start over with a cleaner slate. But it wasn't a final solution. The ongoing conflict between good and evil, between corruption and preservation, continues in every human heart, in every generation, in every moment when we must choose between the easy path that leads to destruction and the difficult path that leads to life. The giants have returned many times throughout history in many different forms, but they have never achieved the complete dominance they once held in the antediluvian world. The memory of the flood preserved in human culture and consciousness serves as a warning and a protection. The knowledge of what corruption can lead to, the understanding of why divine judgment became necessary, helps each generation recognize the signs and choose a different path. But vigilance is required. The corruption that created the giants is patient, persistent, always seeking new ways to manifest, new vulnerabilities to exploit. The price of freedom from such corruption is eternal watchfulness, the willingness to recognize threats even when they come disguised as benefits, the courage to resist influences that promise much but deliver enslavement. The story of Noah's Ark and the giants isn't just about the past, it's about the present and the future. It's about understanding the true nature of the conflict we're all part of, whether we realize it or not. It's about choosing sides in a war that has been raging since the beginning of time, between the forces that would corrupt humanity and those that would preserve it. The waters have receded, but the lessons remain. The giants have fallen, but the potential for their return persists. The ark has served its purpose, but the need for preservation continues. In every generation, in every culture, in every human heart, the same choice must be made. Corruption or preservation, death or life. The easy path that leads to destruction or the difficult path that leads to eternal joy. The world that emerged from the receding waters was a place of profound silence and terrible beauty. Where once the earth had teemed with the sounds of countless civilizations, now only the wind spoke, carrying with it the echoes of a judgment so complete that it had rewritten the very foundations of reality. But in this silence, something else was stirring. Something that would challenge everything we thought we knew about the flood's finality. The archaeological record tells a story that mainstream science struggles to explain. Massive megalithic structures scattered across the globe, built with precision that rivals our modern capabilities. Stone blocks weighing hundreds of tons fitted together so perfectly that a knife blade cannot slip between them. Construction techniques that seem to require knowledge of engineering principles that wouldn't be formally discovered for thousands of years. These aren't the crude monuments of primitive peoples struggling to rebuild after a catastrophe. These are the works of minds that possessed sophisticated understanding of mathematics, astronomy, and physics. They represent knowledge that seems to have appeared fully formed in the post-flood world, as if it had been preserved through the catastrophe by means we don't yet understand. But perhaps the most unsettling aspect of these discoveries is their global distribution. Similar construction techniques appear on every continent, in cultures that supposedly had no contact with each other. The same astronomical alignments, the same mathematical constants, the same symbols and motifs appearing in places separated by thousands of miles of ocean. It's as if the same source of knowledge had influenced the development of civilizations around the world. The question that haunts researchers is simple. Where did this knowledge come from? How did societies that were supposedly starting from scratch after the flood manage to achieve such sophisticated understanding so quickly? The traditional explanations about gradual development and independent innovation begin to break down when confronted with the evidence of what ancient peoples actually accomplished. Some scholars have suggested that this knowledge was preserved through the flood by human survivors who possessed advanced understanding from the antediluvian world. But the biblical account is clear that only Noah's family survived the global catastrophe. 8 people focused on preserving life rather than technology carried forward into the new world. Where would they have acquired the sophisticated knowledge that appears in post-flood civilizations? The answer may lie in realms that conventional archaeology is reluctant to explore. The ancient texts speak of knowledge that was written in the stones and preserved in the blood. They describe understanding that was passed down not through books or oral tradition, but through genetic memory and spiritual inheritance. These cryptic references suggest that the giants who ruled the antediluvian world had found ways to preserve their knowledge that went beyond physical storage. Consider the implications of this possibility. If the giants had somehow encoded their understanding into the very structure of reality itself, then that knowledge would have survived the flood regardless of whether any giants physically endured the catastrophe. It would have been waiting in the post-flood world, ready to be accessed by those who possess the right keys, the right bloodlines, the right spiritual connections. This would explain the sudden appearance of advanced knowledge in early post-flood civilizations. It would account for the similarity of techniques and symbols across supposedly isolated cultures. It would provide a framework for understanding how societies that should have been struggling to survive managed to achieve architectural and engineering feats that challenge our understanding of what was possible in the ancient world. But this preserved knowledge wouldn't have been neutral. It would have carried with it the same corruption that had characterized the giants who originally possessed it. The techniques and understanding that had been used to dominate and corrupt the antediluvian world would have been embedded within the very knowledge that post-flood civilizations accessed. This creates a disturbing picture of human development after the flood. Instead of starting with a clean slate, early civilizations would have been drawing on a poisoned well of knowledge. The same understanding that had once been used to corrupt humanity would have been influencing the development of new societies, gradually recreating the conditions that had led to the flood in the first place. The evidence for this process can be seen in the archaeological record. Many ancient civilizations show signs of rapid advancement followed by sudden collapse. Sophisticated technologies that appear suddenly and then vanish just as quickly. Artistic and architectural achievements that seem to exceed the capabilities of their creators, followed by periods of decline and abandonment. These patterns suggest that ancient peoples were accessing knowledge that was beyond their natural ability to understand or control. They were drawing on the preserved wisdom of the giants, but they lacked the full context necessary to use it safely. The result was a cycle of advancement and corruption, achievement and collapse, that repeated itself across cultures and time periods. The builders of the Great Pyramids, for instance, demonstrated knowledge of mathematics and engineering that seems impossible for their supposed level of technological development. They encoded astronomical data into their monuments with precision that wouldn't be matched for thousands of years. They moved stones that would challenge modern construction equipment, using techniques that we still don't fully understand. But these achievements came at a cost. The civilization that built the pyramids was built on slavery and oppression, on the systematic exploitation of human labor for the glorification of rulers who claimed divine status. The knowledge that enabled such architectural marvels was coupled with social structures that resembled the corruption of the antediluvian world. Similar patterns appear in civilizations around the world. The builders of Stonehenge demonstrated sophisticated understanding of astronomy and acoustic engineering, creating a monument that functions as both observatory and sound amplifier. But the society that built it also practiced human sacrifice and ritualistic violence that echoes the corruption of the giants. The ancient civilizations of the Americas showed remarkable knowledge of mathematics and astronomy, creating calendars and observatories that tracked celestial movements with incredible precision. But they also developed religious systems that demanded human sacrifice on a massive scale, feeding thousands of victims to gods who promised power and prosperity in exchange for blood. These aren't coincidences. They're evidence of a pattern that connects advanced knowledge with spiritual corruption, technological achievement with moral decay. The preserved wisdom of the giants carried within it the same spiritual poison that had corrupted the antediluvian world, and it continued to corrupt every civilization that accessed it. But the corruption wasn't always obvious. It often appeared as progress, as advancement, as the natural development of human civilization. The technologies were impressive, the achievements undeniable. Only those who understood the true source of the knowledge could recognize the spiritual danger it represented. This is why the biblical accounts of encounters with giant-influenced civilizations are so important. They provide a framework for understanding the spiritual reality behind the impressive achievements. They reveal that technological advancement and architectural sophistication aren't necessarily signs of moral progress. They can be symptoms of spiritual corruption, evidence that a civilization has accessed knowledge that comes with a terrible price. The Israelites who encountered the giants in Canaan weren't just facing militarily superior enemies. They were confronting civilizations that had been corrupted by the same spiritual forces that had once threatened to destroy all humanity. The cities they conquered weren't just strategic objectives. They were centers of corruption that had to be eliminated before they could spread their influence further. This understanding transforms our perception of these ancient conflicts. They weren't just battles between different peoples fighting over territory and resources. They were engagements in a spiritual war that had been raging since the fall of the giants, a conflict between the forces of corruption and preservation that determined the future of human civilization. The complete destruction that God commanded the Israelites to carry out wasn't excessive military action. It was spiritual surgery, the removal of corrupted elements before they could contaminate the larger human population. The artifacts that were to be destroyed weren't just valuable spoils of war. They were repositories of corrupted knowledge that could corrupt anyone who accessed them. But the corruption wasn't limited to the obvious giant strongholds. It was also working through more subtle channels, through human leaders who had been influenced by giant knowledge, through religious systems that incorporated fallen angel teachings, through technologies that seemed beneficial but carried hidden spiritual costs. The ancient world was full of such influences. Mystery schools that taught secret knowledge supposedly passed down from the gods. Technological innovations that seemed to come from nowhere, developed by individuals who claimed to have received the knowledge in dreams or visions. Religious practices that involved communion with spiritual beings who offered power and wisdom in exchange for worship and obedience. All of these represented different aspects of the same corruption that had originally produced the giants. They were attempts to recreate the conditions that had existed before the flood, to establish once again a world where fallen angels could influence human affairs through willing human intermediaries. The sophistication of these influences made them particularly dangerous. They didn't present themselves as evil or destructive. They offered genuine benefits, real solutions to pressing problems. The knowledge they provided was often accurate and useful. The technologies they enabled were frequently impressive and beneficial. But embedded within these gifts were spiritual costs that weren't immediately apparent. The knowledge came with assumptions and worldviews that gradually corrupted those who accepted it. The technologies required practices and sacrifices that slowly eroded moral boundaries. The benefits were real, but they came with a price that became clear only after it was too late to reverse course. This pattern of seductive corruption explains why the biblical warnings about these influences are so stern and uncompromising. It's not because the knowledge itself was necessarily evil, but because it was inextricably linked to spiritual corruption that would ultimately destroy those who embraced it. The immediate benefits were outweighed by the long-term costs, but those costs were often invisible until the corruption had already taken hold. The flood had been a reset, a chance for humanity to start over with a cleaner slate. But the preserved knowledge of the giants represented a persistent threat to that fresh start. It was a constant temptation to take shortcuts, to access power and understanding without regard for the spiritual consequences, to repeat the mistakes that had led to the flood in the first place. Each generation faced the same choice that had confronted humanity in the antediluvian world. Whether to seek advancement through proper means or to accept the offerings of entities that promised much but delivered corruption. The knowledge was always there, waiting to be accessed, offering its benefits to those who were willing to pay its price. The civilization that chose correctly prospered in ways that honored both human dignity and divine design. They developed technologies that served human needs without corrupting human nature. They built societies that balanced individual freedom with collective responsibility. They created cultures that preserved knowledge while maintaining wisdom. But the civilizations that chose incorrectly followed the same path as the antediluvian world. They achieved impressive technological advances while losing their moral compass. They built magnificent monuments while enslaving their populations. They accumulated vast knowledge while losing their understanding of right and wrong. The archaeological record shows the results of both paths, civilizations that seem to have developed sustainably, leaving behind evidence of balanced societies that flourished for long periods, and civilizations that achieved rapid advancement followed by sudden collapse, leaving behind impressive ruins and mysterious disappearances. The difference between these outcomes wasn't random. It was the result of choices made by each generation about what kinds of knowledge to pursue, what kinds of influences to accept, what kinds of prices they were willing to pay for advancement. The civilizations that chose wisely survived and prospered. The ones that chose poorly followed the giants into judgment and destruction. This pattern continues today, though the forms have evolved. The same spiritual forces that once worked through giant civilizations now operate through different channels, offering the same kinds of seductive knowledge and power. The technologies are different. The specific applications have changed, but the fundamental choice remains the same. We still face the temptation to access knowledge and power without regard for the spiritual consequences. We still encounter influences that offer impressive benefits while concealing their true costs. We still must choose between the path of corruption and the path of preservation, between the easy road that leads to destruction and the difficult road that leads to life. The story of Noah's Ark and the giants isn't just about ancient history. It's about understanding the spiritual realities that continue to shape human civilization. It's about recognizing the patterns that repeat themselves across cultures and time periods. It's about learning to distinguish between genuine progress and seductive corruption. The flood may have ended, but the conflict continues. The giants may have fallen, but their influence persists. The ark may have served its purpose, but the need for discernment and preservation remains as urgent today as it was in Noah's time. As you drift towards sleep tonight, consider the profound responsibility that comes with this understanding. You live in a world where the same forces that once corrupted the giants continue to offer their gifts to humanity. The knowledge is still there, waiting to be accessed. The choices are still there, waiting to be made. The question isn't whether you'll encounter these influences. You will. The question is whether you'll recognize them for what they are. Whether you'll have the wisdom to distinguish between genuine progress and corrupted advancement. Whether you'll choose the path of preservation or the path of corruption. The waters have receded, but the lessons remain. The giants have fallen, but their legacy continues. The ark has landed, but the journey toward understanding has just begun. In every generation, in every culture, in every human heart, the same choice must be made. Will we learn from the past, or will we repeat its mistakes? The mystery deepens with each archaeological discovery, each ancient text that comes to light, each piece of evidence that challenges our understanding of what really happened in the world after the flood. But through it all, one truth remains constant. The same God who judged the corruption of the giants and preserved life through the ark continues to work in human history, offering both warning and hope to those who have eyes to see and ears to hear. The story continues, the mystery unfolds, and the choice between corruption and preservation awaits each new generation. The giants may be gone, but their influence echoes through time, and the need for wisdom, discernment, and faithfulness remains as urgent today as it was when Noah first heard the command to build an ark against the coming storm. The silence that followed the flood was more than just the absence of sound. It was the absence of corruption itself, as if the very air had been cleansed of influences that had poisoned the world for centuries. But silence, like a vacuum, has a way of drawing things into itself, and in the quiet spaces left by the giant's departure, something else began to stir. The children of Noah grew and multiplied, spreading across the earth like seeds scattered by a careful gardener. But within their bloodlines, within the very fabric of their expanding civilizations, lay dormant possibilities that even Noah himself might not have fully understood. The flood had cleansed the world of active corruption, but it had not eliminated the potential for corruption to return. Consider the mystery that archaeologists still struggle to explain. How did ancient peoples, supposedly starting from scratch after a global catastrophe, manage to achieve such sophisticated understanding of astronomy, mathematics, and engineering? How did they know to align their monuments with celestial events that wouldn't repeat for thousands of years? How did they calculate mathematical constants that modern science has only recently discovered? The answer may lie in something far more profound than preserved libraries or hidden caches of knowledge. It may lie in the very nature of corruption itself, in the way that spiritual influences can embed themselves not just in physical objects, but in the structure of reality itself. The giants who ruled the antediluvian world possessed knowledge that went beyond mere learning. They had access to understanding that transcended the boundaries between the physical and spiritual realms. When the flood waters rose and the giants fell, their bodies were destroyed. But spiritual influences don't die the way physical beings do. They persist, they adapt, they find new ways to manifest their power. The fallen angels who had originally corrupted humanity were still active after the flood, still seeking ways to re-establish their influence over the descendants of Noah. They couldn't simply repeat their original strategy. The flood had served as a warning, a demonstration of what would happen if corruption reached the same levels again. But they could work more subtly, more patiently, seeding their influence into the developing civilizations of the post-flood world. This influence manifested in ways that seemed beneficial at first. A farmer would have a dream about new agricultural techniques that dramatically increased crop yields. A builder would receive visions of construction methods that allowed him to move stones far larger than should have been possible. A priest would experience revelations about astronomical patterns that gave his people significant advantages in navigation and timekeeping. These weren't obviously evil influences. They appeared as gifts, as blessings, as signs of divine favor. The knowledge they provided was genuine and useful. The technologies they enabled were impressive and beneficial. But embedded within these gifts were spiritual costs that wouldn't become apparent until much later. The civilizations that accepted these influences began to develop characteristics that echoed the antediluvian world. They built monuments that seemed designed for beings larger than normal humans. They developed religious systems that emphasized contact with spiritual entities. They created social structures that concentrated power in the hands of individuals who claimed supernatural authority. But perhaps most tellingly, they began to exhibit the same pattern of rapid advancement followed by sudden collapse that had characterized the giant civilizations before the flood. They would achieve remarkable heights of sophistication, and then, seemingly without warning, abandon their cities, lose their technologies, and disappear into the mists of history. The builders of the great megalithic structures around the world represent one manifestation of this pattern. They demonstrated knowledge of engineering and astronomy that seems impossible for their supposed level of technological development. They created monuments that encoded information about celestial cycles, mathematical constants, and acoustic properties that wouldn't be formally understood for thousands of years. But these achievements came at a cost. The societies that built these structures were often characterized by extreme social stratification, ritualistic violence, and religious practices that involved human sacrifice. The knowledge that enabled their architectural marvels was coupled with spiritual corruption that ultimately led to their downfall. The ancient civilizations of Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Indus Valley all show evidence of this pattern. They achieved remarkable levels of sophistication in short periods of time, developing technologies and organizational systems that seem to have appeared fully formed rather than evolving gradually. But they also developed religious and social practices that reflected the same corruption that had characterized the giant civilizations. The question that haunts researchers is why these civilizations consistently chose to couple their technological achievements with spiritual corruption. Why did advanced knowledge so often lead to moral decay? Why did architectural sophistication go hand in hand with human sacrifice and social oppression? The answer may lie in the source of the knowledge itself. If the understanding that enabled these achievements came from the same spiritual forces that had corrupted the giants, then it would have carried within it the same spiritual poison. The knowledge wasn't neutral. It came with assumptions, worldviews, and practices that gradually corrupted those who accepted it. This explains why the biblical accounts of encounters with such civilizations are so stern and uncompromising. The Israelites weren't just facing militarily superior enemies. They were confronting societies that had been corrupted by the same spiritual forces that had once threatened to destroy all humanity. The complete destruction that God commanded wasn't excessive military action. It was spiritual surgery, the removal of corrupted elements before they could spread their influence further. The artifacts that were to be destroyed weren't just valuable spoils of war. They were repositories of corrupted knowledge that could corrupt anyone who accessed them. The cities that were to be razed weren't just strategic objectives. They were centers of corruption that had to be eliminated before they could contaminate the larger human population. But the corruption wasn't limited to the obvious targets. It was also working through more subtle channels, through human leaders who had been influenced by giant knowledge, through religious systems that incorporated fallen angel teachings, through technologies that seemed beneficial but carried hidden spiritual costs. The ancient world was full of such influences. Mystery schools that taught secret knowledge supposedly passed down from the gods. Technological innovations that seemed to come from nowhere, developed by individuals who claimed to have received the knowledge in dreams or visions. Religious practices that involved communion with spiritual beings who offered power and wisdom in exchange for worship and obedience. All of these represented different aspects of the same corruption that had originally produced the giants. They were attempts to recreate the conditions that had existed before the flood, to establish once again a world where fallen angels could influence human affairs through willing human intermediaries. The sophistication of these influences made them particularly dangerous. They didn't present themselves as evil or destructive. They offered genuine benefits, real solutions to pressing problems. The knowledge they provided was often accurate and useful. The technologies they enabled were frequently impressive and beneficial. But embedded within these gifts were spiritual costs that weren't immediately apparent. The knowledge came with assumptions and worldviews that gradually corrupted those who accepted it. The technologies required practices and sacrifices that slowly eroded moral boundaries. The benefits were real, but they came with a price that became clear only after it was too late to reverse course. This pattern of seductive corruption explains why the biblical warnings about these influences are so stern and uncompromising. It's not because the knowledge itself was necessarily evil, but because it was inextricably linked to spiritual corruption that would ultimately destroy those who embraced it. The immediate benefits were outweighed by the long-term costs, but those costs were often invisible until the corruption had already taken hold. The flood had been a reset, a chance for humanity to start over with a cleaner slate. But the preserved influence of the giants represented a persistent threat to that fresh start. It was a constant temptation to take shortcuts, to access power and understanding without regard for the spiritual consequences, to repeat the mistakes that had led to the flood in the first place. Each generation faced the same choice that had confronted humanity in the antediluvian world, whether to seek advancement through proper means or to accept the offerings of entities that promised much but delivered corruption. The influence was always there, waiting to be accessed, offering its benefits to those who were willing to pay its price. The civilizations that chose correctly prospered in ways that honored both human dignity and divine design. They developed technologies that served human needs without corrupting human nature. They built societies that balanced individual freedom with collective responsibility. They created cultures that preserved knowledge while maintaining wisdom. But the civilizations that chose incorrectly followed the same path as the antediluvian world. They achieved impressive technological advances while losing their moral compass. They built magnificent monuments while enslaving their populations. They accumulated vast knowledge while losing their understanding of right and wrong. The archaeological record shows the results of both paths. Civilizations that seem to have developed sustainably, leaving behind evidence of balanced societies that flourished for long periods, and civilizations that achieved rapid advancement followed by sudden collapse, leaving behind impressive ruins and mysterious disappearances. The difference between these outcomes wasn't random. It was the result of choices made by each generation about what kinds of knowledge to pursue, what kinds of influences to accept, what kinds of prices they were willing to pay for advancement. The civilizations that chose wisely survived and prospered. The ones that chose poorly followed the giants into judgment and destruction. This pattern continues today, though the forms have evolved. The same spiritual forces that once worked through giant civilizations now operate through different channels, offering the same kinds of seductive knowledge and power. The technologies are different, the specific applications have changed, but the fundamental choice remains the same. We still face the temptation to access knowledge and power without regard for the spiritual consequences. We still encounter influences that offer impressive benefits while concealing their true costs. We still must choose between the path of corruption and the path of preservation, between the easy road that leads to destruction and the difficult road that leads to life. The story of Noah's Ark and the giants isn't just about ancient history. It's about understanding the spiritual realities that continue to shape human civilization. It's about recognizing the patterns that repeat themselves across cultures and time periods. It's about learning to distinguish between genuine progress and seductive corruption. The flood may have ended, but the conflict continues. The giants may have fallen, but their influence persists. The ark may have served its purpose, but the need for discernment and preservation remains as urgent today as it was in Noah's time. As you drift toward sleep tonight, consider the profound responsibility that comes with this understanding. You live in a world where the same forces that once corrupted the giants continue to offer their gifts to humanity. The knowledge is still there, waiting to be accessed. The choices are still there, waiting to be made. The question isn't whether you'll encounter these influences. You will. The question is whether you'll recognize them for what they are. Whether you'll have the wisdom to distinguish between genuine progress and corrupted advancement. Whether you'll choose the path of preservation or the path of corruption. The waters have receded, but the lessons remain. The giants have fallen, but their legacy continues. The ark has landed, but the journey toward understanding has just begun. In every generation, in every culture, in every human heart, the same choice must be made. Will we learn from the past, or will we repeat its mistakes? The mystery deepens with each archaeological discovery, each ancient text that comes to light, each piece of evidence that challenges our understanding of what really happened in the world after the flood. But through it all, one truth remains constant. The same God who judged the corruption of the giants and preserved life through the ark continues to work in human history, offering both warning and hope to those who have eyes to see and ears to hear. Rest now in the knowledge that even in the darkest chapters of human history, even when giants walked the earth and corruption seemed to reign supreme, there was always a plan. There was always a purpose. There was always a way forward for those who chose faithfulness over convenience, truth over comfort, righteousness over success. The story continues. The mystery unfolds, and the choice between corruption and preservation awaits each new generation. The giants may be gone, but their influence echoes through time, and the need for wisdom, discernment, and faithfulness remains as urgent today as it was when Noah first heard the command to build an ark against the coming storm. Sleep well, knowing that the same God who preserved life through the flood continues to watch over those who trust in him. The ark has served its purpose, but the promise of the rainbow remains. Never again will the earth be destroyed by water, but the choice between good and evil, between corruption and preservation, between the giant's legacy and God's design, continues in every human heart. The final mystery remains, whispered in the wind that blows across ancient ruins and echoes through the corridors of time. What became of the giant's knowledge? What happened to the secrets they carried, the wisdom they possessed, the understanding they had gained from sources beyond the natural world? The answer may be more profound than we've ever imagined. The giants didn't simply disappear when the floodwaters rose. They left behind something far more lasting than their physical forms. Something that continues to influence human civilization to this day. They left behind a legacy encoded in the very fabric of reality itself. Consider the mysteries that surround us even now. The ancient monuments that defy our understanding of what should have been possible. The technologies that appear suddenly in the archaeological record, fully formed and sophisticated. The knowledge that seems to have been passed down through generations, preserved in symbols and stories that appear in cultures around the world. These aren't just curiosities for historians and archaeologists to puzzle over. They're evidence of an ongoing influence that transcends the boundaries of time and space. The giants may have perished in the flood, but their impact on human development continues to unfold in ways that most people never recognize. The corruption that once threatened to destroy all humanity didn't end with the rising waters. It adapted, evolved, found new ways to manifest itself in the post-flood world. The same spiritual forces that had once worked through physical giants now operate through different channels, offering the same seductive knowledge and power to each new generation. But there's hope in this understanding. The story of Noah's Ark isn't just about judgment and destruction. It's about preservation and renewal. It's about the power of faithfulness to overcome even the most overwhelming corruption. It's about the promise that no matter how dark the world becomes, there's always a way forward for those who choose to trust in divine wisdom rather than human pride. The ark that carried life through the flood continues to carry meaning through the ages. It reminds us that even when giants walk the earth, even when corruption seems to reign supreme, even when the very foundations of reality appear to be shaking, there's always hope for those who choose the path of righteousness. The rainbow that appeared after the flood still appears in our skies today, a reminder of the promise that never again will the earth be destroyed by water. But it's also a reminder of something deeper, that divine mercy triumphs over judgment, that preservation is stronger than destruction, that life ultimately conquers death. As you rest tonight, let your mind drift toward that ancient truth. The giants are gone, but their story continues to teach us about the choices we face in our own lives. The flood has ended, but the lessons it taught about corruption and preservation remain as relevant today as they were thousands of years ago. The mystery of Noah's Ark and the giants isn't just about understanding the past. It's about preparing for the future. It's about recognizing that the same forces that once threatened humanity continue to work in our world, offering the same temptations, presenting the same choices, demanding the same wisdom and discernment. But it's also about knowing that the same God who preserved life through the flood continues to watch over those who trust in him. The same divine power that lifted the ark above the rising waters continues to lift faithful hearts above the storms of life. The same promise that brought Noah safely through the catastrophe continues to offer hope to all who choose the path of righteousness. Sleep well, knowing that you're part of a story that began in the depths of antiquity and continues to unfold today. The giants may be gone, but their legacy reminds us that every generation must choose between corruption and preservation, between the easy path that leads to destruction and the difficult path that leads to life. The ark has served its purpose, but the journey continues. The flood has ended, but the choice between good and evil remains. The giants have fallen, but the need for wisdom, faithfulness, and divine guidance remains as urgent today as it was when Noah first heard the command to build a vessel against the coming storm. Rest now in the knowledge that no matter what giants may rise in your own life, no matter what floods may threaten your peace, there's always an ark of divine protection available to those who choose to trust in the God who created the heavens and the earth. The mystery continues, but so does the hope. The story goes on and you're part of it.